I spent 18 months saving lives in combat zones across 3 countries, but nothing prepared me for the war zone I found in my own living room. My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell, trauma surgeon, Army major, and I just returned from deployment to find my husband had abandoned his dying stepfather to go on a Caribbean cruise with money stolen from our joint account. What they didn't know was that before Colonel James took his final breath, we would execute a medical procedure that would remove the cancer from our family permanently. The operation was precise, brutal, and absolutely necessary. Sometimes the only way to save a patient is to cut out everything that's killing them, and my husband's family was a malignant tumor that had been spreading for far too long. The Hippocratic Oath begins with a simple promise. First, do no harm. But sometimes I've learned the greatest harm comes from doing nothing at all. Because what I'm about to share will show you exactly what happens when a combat surgeon applies battlefield triage to family relationships. 18 months earlier, I had kissed my husband David goodbye on the tarmac at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He was crying, clutching my hands through the chain link fence as my unit prepared to deploy to Syria. David Chen was everything I wasn't: gentle where I was firm, emotional where I was clinical, artistic where I was scientific. He taught high school art and spent his weekends painting watercolor landscapes that he sold at local farmers markets. We had met during my residency at Vanderbilt when I was pulling 36-hour shifts and surviving on nothing but caffeine and determination. David would bring me homemade soup and sit quietly in the break room while I ate, never complaining about my blood-stained scrubs or the way I fell asleep mid-conversation. He understood that saving lives was my calling, even when it meant months of separation and years of uncertainty. But what David never understood was the concept of honor. In the Army, honor isn't just a word you say during ceremonies. It's the code that separates warriors from civilians, healers from pretenders. It's the sacred trust between soldier and soldier, doctor and patient, family and family. Honor means you don't abandon your post, you don't abandon your mission, and you sure as heck don't abandon the people who depend on you. As I drove through the Tennessee mountains on that cold November morning, snow beginning to dust the windshield of my rental car, I thought I was coming home to a man who understood that code. I thought I was coming home to someone who had spent 18 months holding down the fort, taking care of business, being the support system our family needed. I had no idea I was driving straight into an ambush. The house looked wrong before I even got out of the car. Our modest 2-story colonial sat dark against the gray sky. No warm lights in the windows, no smoke from the chimney that David always kept burning during the cold months. The driveway was empty except for Colonel James Morrison's old pickup truck, the blue Ford F-150 that he'd driven since retiring from the military 15 years ago. Colonel James Morrison wasn't technically my stepfather. He was David's stepfather, the man who had raised David after his biological father walked out when David was 12. But from the moment I married into the family, James treated me like the daughter he'd never had. He was old school Army, a Vietnam veteran who had served 3 tours and came home to build a successful construction company with his bare hands and pure determination. When James was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 8 months into my deployment, I'd called him every week from whatever forward operating base had the strongest satellite signal. We talked about his treatment, his pain levels, his prognosis. James never complained, never asked for sympathy, but I could hear the exhaustion in his voice as the chemotherapy ravaged his system and the disease continued its merciless advance. David assured me he was handling everything. He said James was comfortable, that the medications were managing his pain, that hospice care was coming twice a week to help with his needs. David sent me photos of James sitting in his favorite recliner, smiling weakly but giving me a thumbs up. Everything looked under control. But as I stood in that empty driveway with my deployment bag slung over my shoulder, looking at a house that felt abandoned, I started to understand that everything I had been told was a lie. I found the spare key under the fake rock by the front steps, the same hiding place we'd used since David and I first bought this house 5 years ago. The lock turned easily, but the door stuck slightly, like it hadn't been opened in days. The smell hit me immediately. It wasn't the warm scent of David's cooking, or the faint medicinal smell I expected from a house where someone was receiving end-stage cancer care. It was the smell of neglect. Stale air, unwashed dishes, and underneath it all, something sharp and acrid that made my medical training kick into high alert. I dropped my bag and called out, David, James, I'm home. Silence answered me. Not the comfortable silence of people sleeping or resting, but the heavy, oppressive silence of abandonment. I moved through the house like I was clearing a building in hostile territory. Kitchen first, dirty dishes piled in the sink, empty takeout containers stacked on the counter. No evidence of home cooked meals or the kind of care a sick man needed. The refrigerator was nearly empty except for some expired milk and a few containers of leftover Chinese food. Living room next, James's recliner sat empty. The throw blanket crumpled on the floor, prescription bottles scattered across the side table like abandoned ammunition. I picked up one of the bottles and read the label. Morphine sulfate prescribed 2 weeks ago, nearly full. For someone in the final stages of pancreatic cancer, to have a nearly full bottle of pain medication meant either he wasn't taking it or he wasn't here to take it. That's when I heard it. A weak cough coming from upstairs, from the guest bedroom where James had been staying since climbing stairs became too difficult for him. I took the steps 3 at a time, my heart hammering against my ribs, medical instincts overriding everything else. The guest bedroom door was closed. I knocked gently and heard a faint voice say, "Come in." I pushed the door open and felt my world tilt sideways. James was lying in bed, but barely. The man who had once stood 6 feet 4 inches and commanded construction crews with a voice that could be heard over jackhammers now looked like a skeleton wrapped in gray skin. He was wearing pajamas that hung off his frame like clothes on a scarecrow, and his eyes were sunken so deep in his skull that he looked like he was already halfway to the grave. But it was his face when he saw me that broke something inside my chest. Relief. Pure, desperate relief, like a man who had given up hope, suddenly seeing rescue on the horizon. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Angel, you came back." I was across the room in 2 strides, dropping to my knees beside the bed. I reached for his hand and felt how cold his skin was, how thin his pulse felt beneath my fingers. "James, where's David? When did he last check on you?" James's eyes flickered away from mine. There was shame there, the kind of shame a proud man feels when he's been abandoned by the people who were supposed to care for him. "He left Tuesday morning," James said slowly. "Said he needed a break. Said hospice would handle everything." Tuesday morning. Today was Friday. David had been gone for 3 days. "Where did he go, James?" I asked, though something in my gut already knew the answer was going to destroy me. James looked at the nightstand beside his bed. There was a crumpled piece of paper sitting next to a glass of water that looked like it hadn't been touched in days. "He left a note," James said. I picked up the paper and smoothed it out. David's handwriting hurried and careless. "James, hospice will check on you tomorrow. Sarah gets back Friday, so you'll be fine until then. Mom and I decided to take that cruise deal we saw advertised. We both needed some sun and time to decompress before Sarah gets home. Be back Sunday night. Don't worry about anything. D." I read the note 3 times before the full horror of it sank in. David hadn't just left. He had abandoned a dying man for a vacation cruise. He had taken his mother, Maria, on a trip using money we didn't have while his stepfather lay here in this bed, alone, scared, and slowly dying without anyone to care for him. But it was the last line that made my blood run cold. Don't worry about anything. As if worry was the problem. As if James's concern about being alone was just an inconvenience rather than a legitimate fear of dying without dignity. "James," I said carefully, "when was the last time you had a proper meal?" He thought about it. "Wednesday, I think. Maybe Thursday. David left some sandwiches, but..." He gestured weakly toward the nightstand where I could see the remains of what looked like a peanut butter sandwich, hard and curled at the edges. "When was the last time someone helped you to the bathroom?" James's face crumpled with humiliation. "I've been trying to hold it. The walk is too far, and I kept thinking someone would come." I looked around the room and noticed the smell I'd detected downstairs was stronger here. James had been lying in his own waste because he was too weak to get to the bathroom and too proud to soil himself deliberately. The sheets beneath him were stained, and the mattress probably was too. When was the last time you took your pain medication? Tuesday night. David said the pills were expensive and I shouldn't take them unless the pain was really bad. I stood up so fast the room spun. James, you have stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The pain is supposed to be managed around the clock. You're not supposed to suffer just to save money on medication. James nodded weakly. That's what I thought, but David said you'd be mad if we spent too much while you were deployed. The anger that hit me was so sudden and so pure that for a moment I couldn't see straight. David had not only abandoned James physically, he had convinced him that taking prescribed pain medication was somehow a financial burden I wouldn't approve of. He had manipulated a dying man into suffering needlessly while he went on a cruise. But I was a trauma surgeon, and trauma surgeons don't have the luxury of falling apart in crisis situations. I compartmentalized the anger, locked it away in a part of my brain where I could access it later, and focused on what needed to be done immediately. James, I need to get you cleaned up and get some food in you. Then we're going to get your pain under control and figure out exactly what's been happening here while I was gone. James squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left. Sarah, I need to tell you something. About the money. About what David's been doing. My stomach dropped. What about the money, James? James reached under his pillow and pulled out a small notebook, the kind contractors use to keep track of expenses on job sites. His hand shook as he handed it to me. I've been keeping track, he said. I know I'm dying, but I'm not senile yet. I've been watching. I opened the notebook. Page after page of David's financial activities, written in James's careful, shaky handwriting. Dates, amounts, transactions. David had been systematically draining our joint account for months, small amounts at first, then larger and larger sums. $500 September 15th. Art supplies, no art supplies purchased. $200 October 3rd. House repairs, no repairs done. $800 October 20th. James's medical expenses. James, you never saw any of this money. $2,500 November 8th. Emergency car repair. Car fine, $4,000. November 15th, cruise deposit and expenses. The final total at the bottom of the page made my knees weak. 12,300 years. David had stolen over $12,000 from our joint account while I was deployed. Money I had saved from combat pay and hazardous duty allowances specifically for emergencies in James's care. James, I said slowly, how do you know about all this? James pointed to his dresser where a laptop sat open. David thought I was too sick to notice, but I still check the bank account online every few days. Old habits from running a business. His voice was getting weaker, but there was steel underneath the exhaustion. I printed out the statements. They're in the top drawer. I walked to the dresser and pulled out a stack of papers. Bank statements, credit card bills, receipts. David hadn't just been stealing from our joint account. He had opened credit cards in both our names, run up massive debts, and even taken a cash advance against the house. But the receipt that made my hands shake with fury was stapled to the most recent bank statement. Royal Caribbean Cruise Lines, balcony suite, $4,847, Thanksgiving Caribbean getaway, November 21st, 28. David was on a luxury cruise. While James lay here dying, while I was serving my country overseas, while our finances were being destroyed, David was sipping drinks on a ship deck with his mother, enjoying a Thanksgiving vacation that cost more than most people made in 2 months. There's something else, James said quietly. I looked at him, not sure I could handle another revelation. The hospice nurses. They haven't been coming. David canceled the service 2 weeks ago, said it was too expensive and that Maria could handle my care when needed. I felt the last piece of my faith in David crumble into dust. He hadn't just abandoned James for a vacation. He had systematically isolated him, canceled his care, stolen his money, and left him to die alone while I was serving my country and trusting that my family was being taken care of. If you've ever had someone you trusted completely betray that trust when you needed them most, tell me in the comments. I read every single one of your stories. James, I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane of anger building inside me, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to get you cleaned up, get your pain under control, and make sure you're comfortable. But I'm also going to need your help with something. James looked at me with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 73 years and 3 tours of duty in Vietnam. He understood exactly what I was asking. What do you need, Doc? The fact that he called me Doc instead of Sarah told me everything I needed to know. We weren't just family anymore. We were fellow soldiers, and soldiers don't abandon each other. I need documentation. I need proof of everything David has done. And I need you to help me understand exactly how bad this situation really is. James nodded slowly. Sarah, there's a safe in the closet behind my winter coats. The combination is your birthday, month, day, year. There are things in there that David doesn't know about, things that are going to matter when this is all over. I looked at this dying man, this warrior who had been abandoned by his stepson, betrayed by his family, left to suffer alone. But he hadn't given up. He had been gathering intelligence, keeping records, preparing for exactly this moment. James, I said, before we do anything else, I need to ask you something. Do you trust me? He smiled, and for just a moment, I could see the strong, commanding man he had been before cancer ravaged his body. Doc, he said, you're the only one I trust. Good, I said, pulling out my phone. Because we're about to perform surgery on this family, and I'm going to need you as my surgical assistant. I spent the next hour getting James cleaned up and comfortable. I drew a warm bath, helped him into clean clothes, and got some soup into him. Actual nutrition, not the crackers and stale sandwiches David had left behind. I administered his pain medication on the proper schedule, watched his face relax, as the morphine finally gave him relief from the agony he'd been enduring for days. While James rested, I went to the safe in his closet. Inside, I found documents that painted an even darker picture than I had imagined. David had been forging my signature on financial documents. He had taken out loans against James's truck. He had even been in contact with a realtor about selling James's house while I was deployed, planning to move James into a nursing home and pocket the proceeds. But the document that made my blood run cold was a copy of James's will. David was listed as the primary beneficiary, inheriting James's house, his savings, and his life insurance policy. The will was dated 3 months ago, right around the time David's spending had escalated dramatically. I sat on James's bedroom floor, surrounded by evidence of betrayal so comprehensive and calculated that it took my breath away. This wasn't just neglect or poor judgment. This was elder abuse, financial exploitation, and fraud on a massive scale. When James woke up from his nap, I showed him what I had found. His face went through a range of emotions: surprise, hurt, disappointment, and finally, cold fury. That lying snake, he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. I raised him. I put him through college. I walked him down the aisle at your wedding because his real father couldn't be bothered to show up. James, I said carefully, I need to know something. Did you actually sign this will? James looked at the document and shook his head. I've never seen this before in my life. That's not my signature. He pointed to the signature line with a trembling finger. Look at the date, October 15th. I was in the hospital that day for chemotherapy. I couldn't have signed anything. Forgery. David had forged a dying man's will to steal his inheritance. There's something else, now James said. In the safe, there's a folder marked Sarah. I've been working on something since you deployed. Something I want you to see. I found the folder. Inside were legal documents that made my hands shake. James had been quietly working with an attorney to set up a trust fund in my name. He had liquidated his investments, sold off equipment from his construction company, and accumulated a fund worth over $200,000 specifically to ensure I would be financially secure after his death. You were going to give this to me? I asked. You're the daughter I never had, Sarah. You're the only one who's ever treated me with the respect a soldier deserves. James's voice was getting weaker, but his eyes were bright with determination. David thinks he's going to inherit my money and your money. He thinks he can steal from both of us and cruise away into the sunset. James reached for my hand. But what he doesn't know is that I've been planning too. And now that you're here, we can execute the mission. I looked at this dying man, this warrior who had been betrayed by his family but had never stopped fighting. What do you need me to do, Colonel? James smiled. Help me change my will. Help me make some phone calls. And help me show that boy what happens when you betray the trust of people who served their country. I stood up and snapped to attention. Yes, sir, Colonel. What are your orders? First, James said, we document everything. Every financial transaction, every forged signature, every day I've been abandoned here. Then we make sure David comes home to face the music. And then? I asked. James's smile turned determined. Then we perform surgery. We cut the cancer out of this family once and for all. As I sat there holding the hand of a dying war hero who had been abandoned by his own stepson, I felt something shift inside me. The part of me that had been a loving wife, that had made excuses for David's weaknesses, that had tried to see the good in everyone, died in that moment. What took its place was something harder, colder, and infinitely more focused. A trauma surgeon who had just identified a malignant tumor that needed to be removed. A soldier who had just discovered the enemy was inside the wire. David thought he was coming home to a naive wife who would forgive his betrayals and accept his excuses. He had no idea he was walking into an operating theater where two combat veterans were preparing to perform the most precise and necessary surgery of their lives. The patient was our family. The tumor was David himself. And failure was not an option. If you believe that our veterans deserve respect and dignity in their final days, please hit that like button right now. And tomorrow, I'll tell you exactly how two soldiers executed the most strategic operation of their lives. The next 48 hours were the most strategic 48 hours of my life. James and I worked like the tactical team we had become, two soldiers preparing for the most important mission either of us would ever undertake. But what David didn't know was that while he was sipping cocktails in the Caribbean, we were building a case that would destroy him more completely than any weapon ever could. Saturday morning, I called Patricia Williams, James's attorney. She arrived within 2 hours, a sharp woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of eyes that missed nothing. When she walked into James's bedroom and saw the evidence we had compiled, her professional composure cracked for just a moment. My goodness, she whispered, looking at the forged will. This is beyond elder abuse. This is organized fraud. James was propped up in bed, looking more alert than he had since I'd arrived. The proper pain management and nutrition had given him enough strength for what we needed to do. Patricia, he said, his voice steady, I need to revoke this fraudulent will and create a new one. Today. Patricia nodded grimly. James, given the circumstances, I'm going to recommend we also file a police report. What David has done constitutes multiple felonies. Not yet, I said. Both James and Patricia looked at me. We file the police report after David comes home. I want him to face the consequences in person, not get arrested on some cruise ship where he can play the victim. James smiled. The doc wants to conduct the court-martial herself. Patricia understood immediately. You want him to walk into the evidence. You want him to lie to your face so we can document his dishonesty. Exactly, I said. David is going to come home tomorrow expecting to find a grateful wife and a dying old man who's too weak to cause problems. Instead, he's going to find two combat veterans who have been preparing for war. We spent Saturday afternoon rewriting James's will. The new document was brutally simple. David received nothing. His mother, Maria, received nothing. Everything went to me with instructions to donate a significant portion to veterans organizations and cancer research. But the will was just the beginning. Sarah, James said, as Patricia was packing up her documents, there's one more thing we need to do. Something that's going to hurt David more than losing the money. I looked at him curiously. We need to make some phone calls. To people who knew David's real father. To people who know the truth about how I raised him after his father abandoned him. James pulled out an old address book, the leather cover worn smooth from years of use. David has spent his entire adult life telling people that his stepfather was just some old soldier who married his mother. He's never admitted that I'm the one who paid for his college, bought his first car, walked him down the aisle at your wedding. I felt a chill of understanding. You want to expose him publicly. You want people to know exactly how he repaid your kindness. I want the truth told, James said simply. I want people to know that when a Vietnam veteran was dying of cancer, the boy he raised like his own son stole his money and abandoned him for a cruise. Sunday afternoon, David's SUV pulled into the driveway at exactly 4:30 p.m. I watched from James's bedroom window as David and Maria climbed out, both of them tan and relaxed, laughing about something as they pulled oversized luggage from the back of the vehicle. David was wearing a tropical shirt and cargo shorts like he was still on vacation. Maria had on a sundress and a wide-brimmed hat that probably cost more than James's monthly medication budget. They looked like tourists returning from paradise, not family members coming home to check on a dying relative. They're here, I told James. James nodded. He was sitting up in bed wearing his old army dress uniform that I had pressed for him that morning. The uniform hung loose on his diminished frame, but the ribbons and medals on his chest told the story of a man who had served his country with honor. Remember the plan, James said. I nodded. I was wearing my Army combat uniform, my medical insignia polished, my rank clearly visible. We weren't just family members having a difficult conversation. We were two soldiers conducting a court-martial. I heard the front door open and David's voice echoing through the house. James, Sarah, we're back. Hope you didn't miss us too much. The casual cheerfulness in his voice made my stomach turn. This was a man who had left his dying stepfather alone for 4 days and come home acting like he'd been running a quick errand. Sarah? David called again. Where is everyone? I heard his footsteps coming up the stairs, probably heading to our bedroom to drop off his luggage before bothering to check on James. In here, I called out. The footsteps paused, then changed direction toward the guest bedroom. David appeared in the doorway, still smiling, still carrying his vacation demeanor. His smile died the moment he saw us. David looked at me in my uniform, then at James in his dress blues, then at the dining room table I had moved into the bedroom. On the table were stacks of documents, the forged will, bank statements, and a digital recorder. What's all this? David asked, but his voice had lost its casual confidence. Sit down, David, I said. My voice was calm, professional, the tone I used in the operating room when delivering bad news to families. David remained standing in the doorway. Why are you both in uniform? What's going on here? I said sit down. This time my voice carried the authority of a major in the United States Army. It wasn't a request. David sat on the edge of the bed, as far from the table as possible. Look, if this is about me going on the cruise, I can explain. Mom really needed the break and you weren't supposed to be. Back until... Stop talking, James said. His voice was weak, but it cut through David's excuses like a blade. You will speak when you're given permission to speak. David's mouth snapped shut. Despite his betrayals, despite his theft, despite everything he had done, David still responded to the voice of command from the man who had raised him. I reached for the first document on the table. David Chen, you are hereby charged with elder abuse, financial fraud, forgery, and abandonment of duty to your family. This is your court-martial. David's face went pale. Court-martial? Sarah, you can't be serious. This is crazy. I went on a vacation. That's not a crime. I told you not to speak, James said. I held up the forged will. Did you sign James's name to this document? David glanced at the paper and I saw recognition flicker in his eyes. I don't know what that is. This is a will dated October 15th, allegedly signed by James Morrison, leaving you as the primary beneficiary of his estate. I stared at David. James was in the hospital receiving chemotherapy on October 15th. He couldn't have signed anything. David's eyes darted between me and James. Maybe the date is wrong. Maybe he signed it earlier and the lawyer made a mistake with the date. So, you admit you knew about this will? David realized he had walked into a trap. I might have seen it. James mentioned wanting to update his will. James leaned forward in his bed. David, I want you to look me in the eye and tell me you didn't forge my signature on that document. David couldn't meet James's gaze. I don't have to answer that. Actually, you do, I said. I pulled out my phone and showed David the screen. Because I've been recording this conversation, and your refusal to deny forgery is going to be very interesting to the district attorney. David's face flushed red. You can't record me without my permission. This is a one-party consent state, I said calmly. I only need my permission to record conversations I'm part of. And since this is my house now, thanks to James's legitimate will, I can record whatever I want. I reach for the bank statements. Let's talk about the money, David. $12,300 stolen from our joint account while I was deployed. David stood up abruptly. That wasn't stolen. That was our money. I needed it for expenses. What expenses? And I asked. James's medical care that you canceled? The food you didn't buy him? The heating bills you didn't pay? I paid for the cruise, David said defiantly. Mom and I deserved a vacation. Do you know how stressful it's been taking care of a sick person? The silence in the room was deafening. James looked at David with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something worse. It was the look of a father realizing that the child he raised had grown into a stranger. Taking care of me, James repeated slowly. David, when was the last time you changed my sheets? David fidgeted. The hospice nurses were supposed to handle that stuff. The hospice care that you canceled 2 weeks ago? David's mouth opened and closed like a fish. That was temporary. It was too expensive. But the cruise wasn't too expensive, I said. $4,847 for a balcony suite. That wasn't too expensive. We worked hard, David said, his voice rising. We deserved a break. We? James asked quietly. David realized what he had said. I meant me. I worked hard. David, I said, what exactly did you do while I was deployed? What work were you doing? David looked confused. I was taking care of things here. You were unemployed, I said flatly. You quit your teaching job in August. You've been living off my deployment pay and James's pension while doing absolutely nothing. David's face crumpled. I was depressed, okay? You were gone. James was sick. Everything was falling apart. I needed help too. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy for David. He looked so pathetic, so lost, sitting there in his tropical shirt trying to justify the unjustifiable. But then I looked at James. This dying war hero who had been abandoned, who had suffered alone, who had been robbed and neglected by the person he had raised as his own son. The sympathy died. David, I said, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I stood up, my uniform crisp, my bearing military straight. James Morrison is a Vietnam veteran who served 3 tours of duty. He came home and built a successful business. He raised you as his own son after your biological father abandoned you. He paid for your college education. He walked you down the aisle at our wedding. He welcomed me into his family and treated me like the daughter he never had. David was staring at the floor. When James was diagnosed with cancer, he trusted you to care for him. When I was deployed serving our country, he trusted you to maintain his dignity and comfort in his final months. I picked up the notebook where James had tracked David's financial theft. Instead, you stole his money. You forged his will. You canceled his medical care. You left him lying in his own waste for 4 days while you went on a cruise. David looked up, tears streaming down his face. I made mistakes. I know I screwed up, but I can fix this. We can work this out. No, James said quietly. We can't. James reached for a manila envelope on the nightstand beside his bed. David, this is a legal document terminating my parental relationship with you. Effective immediately, you are no longer my stepson. You are no longer my heir. You are no longer welcome in my home. David's face went white. You can't do that. You can't just unadopt me. I didn't adopt you, James said. I married your mother and chose to raise you as my son. That was my choice. Now I'm making a different choice. James looked at me. Sarah is my daughter now. She's the only family I have left. I felt tears burning my eyes, but I kept my composure. Thank you, Dad. David stood up shakily. This is insane. You're both having some kind of breakdown. People don't just disown family members. Honorable people don't abandon dying veterans, I said. I walked to the closet and pulled out a large duffel bag. I've packed your belongings, your clothes, your personal items, your art supplies. Everything is in this bag. David stared at the bag. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem, I said, but you have 30 minutes to take your things and leave this house. You can't kick me out, David said desperately. I live here. This is my home too. Actually, James said, the house is in my name. And as of this morning, I've transferred ownership to Sarah. You have no legal right to be here. David turned to me, his eyes wild. Sarah, please. I know I messed up, but I'm your husband. We can go to counseling. We can work through this. I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out my wedding ring. David, our marriage was based on trust, respect, and shared values. You've shown me that you possess none of those qualities. I held out the ring. I'm filing for divorce on Monday. The grounds will be abandonment, financial fraud, and irreconcilable differences. David stared at the ring in my palm like it was a snake. You can't divorce me. You love me. I loved the man I thought you were, I said. That man never existed. James struggled to sit up straighter in his bed. David, before you leave, I want you to understand something. I spent 30 years in the military. I built a successful business. I accumulated wealth and property and respect in this community. David was crying openly now. I gave all of that to you freely, James continued. My love, my money, my home, my name. I asked for nothing in return except basic human decency. James's voice grew stronger. You couldn't even give me that. When I was dying, when I needed you most, you stole from me and abandoned me. David fell to his knees beside James's bed. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was scared and stupid, and I made terrible choices. Please don't do this. Please give me another chance. James looked at David for a long moment. I gave you 18 years of chances. I gave you every opportunity to become a man of honor. You chose a different path. James reached over and pressed the call button that would summon Maria from downstairs. Your mother made the same choices you did. She's equally responsible for what happened here. Footsteps on the stairs announced Maria's arrival. She appeared in the doorway, still wearing her sundress, still carrying the casual vacation attitude that had seemed so jarring when they first arrived. What's all this drama? Maria asked, looking around the room. David, why are you crying? I looked at Maria Chen, a woman who had participated in the abandonment and abuse of her dying husband. Mrs. Chen, you and David need to leave, now. Maria laughed. Excuse me, this is my house too. James is my husband. Was your husband, James corrected. I filed divorce papers yesterday. You'll be served on Monday. Maria's face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, disbelief, anger. You can't divorce me. I'm your wife. I've been taking care of you. You left me to die alone while you went on a cruise, James said simply. We needed a break, Maria shrieked. Do you know how hard it is to watch someone die? Do you know how depressing it is to live in a house with a sick person? The words hung in the air like toxic gas. I stood up and walked over to Maria. Ma'am, you just admitted that caring for your dying husband was too much of an inconvenience for you. You just told a Vietnam veteran that his cancer was depressing your vacation plans. Maria realized what she had said and tried to backtrack. That's not what I meant. I love James. I was just tired. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out! This time I used my command voice, the voice that had directed trauma teams in field hospitals under enemy fire. Get your son, get your luggage, and get out of this house before I call the police. Maria looked at James desperately. James, you can't let her talk to me this way. I'm your wife. James closed his eyes. Sarah, would you please escort these people off the property? I'm very tired. I walked over to David, who was still on his knees beside the bed. David, you have two choices. You can leave voluntarily right now, or I can call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing, forgery, and elder abuse. What's it going to be? David slowly got to his feet. His vacation tan looked sickly under the bedroom lights. I never meant for any of this to happen. But you meant every individual choice that led to this moment, I said. You meant to steal the money. You meant to forge the will. You meant to abandon James. You meant to lie to me. I handed him the duffel bag. Intentions don't matter. Actions do. And your actions have consequences. David took the bag with trembling hands. Where am I supposed to go? I don't have any money. You should have thought of that before you spent $12,000 on a cruise, I said. Maria was becoming hysterical. This is ridiculous. James, you're not thinking clearly. The medications are affecting your judgment. Sarah is manipulating you. James opened his eyes and looked at Maria with the clearest, most lucid expression I had seen from him in days. Maria, in 48 hours, Sarah has shown me more care, respect, and love than you've shown me in the past 6 months. She is not manipulating me. She is protecting me, something my own family failed to do. I walked to the bedroom window and looked outside. There's a taxi waiting in the driveway. I called it for you. The meter is running. David and Maria exchanged looks of panic. They finally understood that this wasn't a fight they could win, a situation they could manipulate, or a decision they could change. David walked over to James one last time. Dad, Don't call me that, James said quietly. You forfeited the right to call me that when you forged my name to steal my money. David's shoulders shook with silent sobs. He turned and walked out of the bedroom without another word. Maria lingered for a moment, looking around the room that had been her home for 8 years. James, when you die, I'm going to contest the will. I'm going to fight this. James smiled. Good luck with that. I've documented everything, including the recording of this conversation, where you admitted that caring for your dying husband was too much trouble for you. Maria's face went ash gray. She finally understood that every word she had spoken had been recorded, that every admission of guilt was now evidence that could be used against her in court. She left without saying another word. I watched from the window as David and Maria climbed into the taxi, their vacation luggage piled in the trunk like the remnants of a life that had just imploded. The taxi pulled away, disappearing down the street into the growing darkness of Sunday evening. I turned back to James. He was lying back against his pillows, looking more peaceful than I had seen him since I'd returned from deployment. How do you feel, Dad? I asked. James smiled. Like a weight has been lifted off my chest. Like I can finally breathe again. I sat down beside his bed. Are you sure about the will? About giving everything to me? I never asked for that. I know you didn't, James said. That's exactly why you deserve it. You're the only person in my life who has ever cared for me without wanting something in return. Over the next 3 days, James's condition deteriorated rapidly. But he wasn't suffering anymore. His pain was managed, his dignity was intact, and he was surrounded by love instead of resentment. On Wednesday morning, James passed away peacefully in his sleep. I was holding his hand when he took his final breath, and his last words were, "Thank you, daughter." The funeral was small but meaningful. James's military buddies came, along with neighbors who had respected him and a few former employees from his construction company. David and Maria were not invited and did not attend. David tried to contact me several times in the weeks that followed. He sent texts, emails, even had flowers delivered with notes begging for forgiveness. I blocked his number, returned his flowers, and filed a restraining order when he showed up at my new apartment. The divorce was finalized within 60 days. David contested it initially, claiming that I had somehow brainwashed James into changing his will. But when Patricia presented the evidence of his fraud, forgery, and theft, his attorney advised him to accept the divorce terms rather than face criminal charges. Maria tried to contest James's will exactly as she had threatened. The case was dismissed within a week when the judge reviewed the evidence of abandonment, the recordings of her admissions, and the documentation of David's crimes. 6 months later, I was promoted to lieutenant colonel and transferred to Walter Reed Army Medical Center. I used part of James's inheritance to establish the Morrison Foundation, which provides financial assistance to veterans' families dealing with terminal illness. A year later, I met Dr. Michael Torres, a fellow Army physician who understood the concepts of honor, duty, and sacrifice. We were married in a small ceremony where James's portrait sat in the front row, and I wore his service ring on a chain around my neck. David sent a wedding gift, a painting he had done of our old house. I returned it unopened. 2 years later, I received a letter from David. He was living in a halfway house, working as a dishwasher, attending therapy and addiction meetings. He had apparently developed a drinking problem after our divorce and had been arrested twice for public intoxication. The letter was full of apologies, explanations, and requests for forgiveness. He claimed he had changed, that he understood now what he had lost, that he wanted to make amends. I read the letter once and threw it away. Because here's what I learned from James Morrison, Vietnam veteran, construction company owner, and the best father a daughter could ask for. Honor is not something you can apologize your way back to. Trust is not something you can rebuild with words. Family is not something defined by blood or marriage certificates. Family is defined by who stands beside you when the artillery is falling. Family is who holds your hand when you're dying. Family is who fights for your dignity when you're too weak to fight for yourself. David thought family meant he could take whatever he wanted and face no consequences. He thought love meant unconditional forgiveness regardless of his actions. He was wrong. If you believe that actions have consequences and that honor matters more than convenience, hit that like button. If you've ever had to choose between toxic family and your own values, tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one, and I want you to know that choosing yourself is not selfish, it's survival. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is surgical removal of the people who are poisoning your life. James taught me that lesson, and I will carry it with me for the rest of my life. Thank you for listening to our story. Thank you for understanding that some battles are worth fighting, even when the enemy wears the face of family. And remember, you don't owe anyone your loyalty if they've never earned it. Honor is a two-way street, and some people never learned how to drive. Dismissed.